Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. Let's talk about that. Guaranteed customers, recession-proof demand. People will always die. That's the pitch you've heard.
And on paper, it sounds like the safest business on earth.
Death doesn't care about interest rates. It doesn't skip a recession.
And it doesn't wait for a better quarter.
Every single day, somewhere in your town, a family needs exactly what you're selling, whether the economy is booming or falling apart. Sounds stable? Almost too stable to be true. And that's exactly the problem. Here's the catch. You're looking at the one fact about this business that's actually true, and quietly ignoring the 50 that aren't. The truth is, a funeral home isn't really a death business.
It's a real estate business. It's a licensing business.
It's an inventory business, caskets, urns, vaults sitting on shelves that happens to deal with death. And once you see it that way, everything about how a funeral home actually makes money and how it can still quietly go broke despite guaranteed demand starts to make sense. Break it into 3 pieces. First, real estate. You need a building, and a good one, in a location families already trust and can find in the worst moment of their lives. Second, licensing. The state controls who can legally operate this business, not the free market, which means competition doesn't work the way it does in most industries. Third, inventory, caskets, urns, and vaults sitting on shelves waiting to be sold. Exactly like a furniture store, except nobody browses for fun and nobody comes back to compare prices next week. Combine those 3 pieces and you get a funeral home. None of them individually screams death industry. Together, they explain almost everything about where the money actually moves and where it quietly disappears before an owner even notices. So let's start where every business starts. What does it actually cost just to open the doors? A funeral home isn't a storefront you rent and staff. It's a licensed facility with a preparation room that has to meet state health code standards for embalming, proper drainage, ventilation, biohazard disposal systems that most small business owners never think about. Building or retrofitting that room alone can run $50,000 to $150,000 before you've touched anything else. Then there's the rest of the building, a chapel or viewing room, a selection room where grieving families choose caskets and urns,
Office space for arrangements,
and parking that can handle 50 cars showing up at once for a single afternoon service. All told, a modest, independent funeral home typically requires $500,000 to $1.5 million just to open its doors, and larger urban facilities with multiple viewing rooms running simultaneous services can run well past $3 million. Then come the vehicles, which most people never budget for. A funeral coach, what you'd call a hearse, costs $90,000 to $150,000 new. A flower car and a family limousine add another $60,000 to $100,000 combined. Because grief doesn't wait politely for your fleet to become available on a busy weekend. And most homes need at least 2 of each. And then there's the license itself, which is arguably the strangest constraint in the entire industry. In most states, the home's license is legally tied to a funeral director being on site or on call at all times. Getting that individual license usually requires a mortuary science degree, a year-long supervised apprenticeship, and a state board exam. If your one licensed director gets sick, quits, or retires unexpectedly, you can be legally unable to operate until you replace them. That's not a staffing inconvenience like it would be at a restaurant. That's a business one single person can switch off. Now here's where the naive mental model really breaks. You'd assume the money is in the casket. It isn't. Not primarily. A traditional funeral with viewing and burial bills somewhere between $9,000 and $12,000. But the casket itself, even marked up 2 to 3 times over wholesale, is usually only $2,000 to $4,000 of that total. The rest comes from a basic services fee, typically $2,000 to $2,500, charged to every single family regardless of what they choose for. The rest of the service, which federal law explicitly says cannot be waived under any circumstances. It's the closest thing this industry has to a membership, except instead of monthly billing, you pay it once and you have no real choice in the matter. That basic fee is the real engine, but the total bill is assembled from a long list of separately billed line items: embalming, transportation, use of the viewing room, use of the hearse, obituary processing, the death certificate, and merchandise around the edges. A family arranging all of this is usually doing it within 24 to 72 hours of a death, exhausted, and rarely in a position to price shop. Directors are trained to walk families through the price list starting from the more expensive end. Families who don't bring a companion or who don't ask for the itemized price list the law requires routinely spend 20 to 40% more than families who do. The selection room is arranged like a car dealership showroom. The priciest caskets up front. The cheapest legally required option tucked in a back corner. Nobody has to lie. It just requires that nobody in the room has shopped for a funeral before. Now for the biggest shift reshaping this entire model, cremation. In the 1960s, it accounted for under 5% of dispositions nationally. Today, it's crossed 60%, and in some states, it's past 80%. A basic direct cremation with no service can be arranged for as little as $1,000 to $3,000, against $9,000 plus for a traditional burial, which on the surface looks like a disaster for margins across the whole industry. But the funeral homes that actually survived this shift didn't fight it head-on. They built a cremation with service package that keeps almost all of the fee-heavy parts of the transaction, drops the expensive casket and burial vault entirely, and still charges $4,000 to $6,000, often at a better margin per hour of staff time than the traditional funeral it quietly replaced. Which brings us to the part of this industry almost nobody outside it fully understands. A large share of the independent, family-owned funeral homes you drive past on Main Street aren't actually independent anymore. Large, publicly traded consolidators, most notably Service Corporation International, which now operates well over 1,000 funeral homes and cemeteries across North America, have spent decades quietly buying up small family operations while deliberately keeping the original founding family's name on the sign out front. The family that sold often stays on as staff for a transition period, sometimes for years, and the surrounding community never notices the ownership actually changed, because the entire point of the acquisition was buying the trust. That comes with a 50-year-old local name, not replacing it with a corporate one. So why would a family sell to a distant conglomerate instead of simply passing the business down to the next generation, the way funeral homes traditionally did for a century? Because this business is capital intensive and thinly staffed by design, and one genuinely bad year, a lawsuit, a licensed director leaving unexpectedly, a discount cremation-only competitor opening 2 miles down the road, can wipe out a small operator's cash reserves fast, sometimes within a single fiscal year. A network spanning 1,000 locations can absorb that same shock without even noticing it on a quarterly report. A single location family owner usually can't, and everyone quietly operating inside this industry already knows it. Even if the families selling their storefronts rarely say it out loud. Here's the case study that makes this concrete. Lowen Group, once the second largest funeral consolidator in North America, spent the 1990s buying small independent homes at premium prices, financed almost entirely with borrowed money. This strategy looked unstoppable. Analysts loved it. The stock climbed. Demand for the core service never wavered. People kept dying. At exactly the same rate, recession or not. But Lowen had systematically overpaid for its acquisitions and loaded the company with interest payments that outran its cash flow. In 1999, it filed for what was, at the time, the largest bankruptcy in Canadian corporate history. It wasn't a demand problem. It was a company with perfectly stable revenue collapsing under a debt structure built for rosier assumptions than reality delivered. So how does the math work for a debt-light independent? A home handling 150 to 200 calls a year, averaging $7,000 per call, brings in $1 million to $1.4 million annually. Fixed costs, mortgage, salaries, vehicles. Insurance typically run $500,000 to $700,000. Net margins land in the 10 to 15% range, meaning owner earnings of $100,000 to $200,000 in a good year. But you don't choose your call volume the way most businesses choose marketing spend. A slow month is simply fewer people dying. There's nothing an owner can do about it. A home built for 200 calls but averaging 160 can watch its margin compress from 15% down to break even, while every fixed cost stays the same. So does anyone actually get this right long term? Yes, and the pattern is almost boring compared to the drama of Lowen's collapse. Picture an independent operator running 2 locations, bought with cash saved over a decade rather than debt, licensing kept inside the family. Critically, This operator never lets pre-need contracts exceed roughly 15% of projected revenue, treating pre-needs as a relationship builder rather than a financing strategy for growth. They diversified into cremation with service packages years before national demand crossed the halfway mark, and added a small florist concession, capturing spending that would otherwise walk out the door. None of this is exciting, and there's no growth hack or viral marketing angle hiding in it anywhere. It's the same three disciplines, repeated patiently for 20 straight years. Keep debt low relative to real estate value. Keep pre-need exposure small relative to total revenue. And diversify the product mix before the market eventually forces you to. Low-end did the exact opposite of all three at once. Same demand curve, same country, same decades. One operator is still quietly profitable today, and the other simply doesn't exist anymore. And that points to something worth sitting with. This business doesn't scale the way most businesses scale. You can't run a campaign and double your call volume next quarter, because customers arrive on a schedule set by mortality tables, not advertising spend. You can't meaningfully cut prices to win share, because itemized pricing rules mean every competitor sees exactly what you charge. Growth here looks like a second location once every 5 or 6 years. Financed conservatively, there's one more slow-moving risk sitting quietly underneath all of this: pre-need contracts. Sold years or even decades in advance and funded through an insurance policy or a state-regulated trust, locking in today's price for a service that might not actually be delivered for another 20 or 30 years. This genuinely helps families. It removes hard decision-making from the single worst moment of their lives. But for the funeral home itself, it means a meaningful share of future revenue is already spoken for at prices set decades earlier. While embalming chemicals, wholesale casket prices, and insurance costs all keep climbing steadily with inflation in the meantime. A home holding a large book of contracts sold back in the 1990s can find itself contractually honoring a $3,000 promise in a year when that exact same service actually costs $8,000 to deliver. So if you do decide to open a funeral home, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you survive. It was never really about whether people will keep dying. They will. Reliably, on a steady schedule you can't influence and never need to market for. It's about whether your fixed costs, your debt, and the pre-need promises you make today can survive 30 full years of a business you can only ever grow through discipline, never through demand.